right, folks. Well, thanks for joining us for another week of the Rec Poker podcast. If you don't know what Rec Poker is all about, we're a group of amateur recreational poker lovers who like to study the game together, learn together, beat each other up in our free play money home games, and just share our love of poker with the world. Most of what we do here is free. We're a largely volunteer organization. So I got to thank our sponsors, the Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino, and Mark Prashon over at Website Amp. And of course, we couldn't do it without our premium members like John Kroll and our core team of Wrecking Crew members, the Wrecking Crew, who puts in time every week, every month, creating videos and having fun. We do some coaching, we do some demonstrations, we run seminars, we have strategy conversations, we do study groups. There's really no limit to what the Wrecking Crew can do for you. And if you want to find out more about me, I'm Jim Reid, Bluffsterini in the home game, and at Rec Poker Jim on Twitter. You can go to rec.poker/crew, because that's where you can learn about everybody on the Wrecking Crew, including a few folks you're going to meet right now.
Well, I'm Chris Jones. You can find me 5B5 on Twitter or 5x5 in the Poker Stars home game.
I'm Keith Brandt, and that's Monkey System everywhere.
I'm Rob Washam, and I'm Radman50 just about everywhere.
And as I mentioned, we record these forums editions after our chats interviews every week. So we just got out of a chats edition, which was a lot of fun. Folks can join us there on YouTube every Monday at 7:30 Eastern. But here for the forums editions, I encourage our premium members to come and join us in the conversation. And so John Kroll is here today. And I hope that more premium members take a lead from John and come jump into this conversation, bring a hand they want to discuss, and get some feedback from the Wrecking Crew right here on the air. But today we're going to be looking at a hand that, a forum post in essence from Chris Jones. Chris is our membership content director, and every month Chris curates a theme of the month. We do a play along seminar. A lot of our material is geared towards this theme that month. And we're going to do one podcast episode each month based on the same subject. So this is August. The theme of the month is playing blind versus blind. And so that's the subject that we're going to talk a little bit about here, Chris. Thank you so much for putting all this amazing content together for our premium members. I'm glad we get to kind of tease some of this high-level stuff for our podcast listeners. I hope they come and join up.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. It's and this was one where we kind of wanted a different topic. There's a lot of travel schedules, a lot of the WSOPs going on. It was hard to get everyone in the same space, so that's why we kind of pulled this one together as one that I felt like we could do justice to without sort of some of the playing sessions and some of those things along. But normally, most of our months we have that, but this month we didn't. But I think we can still. This is a topic that's really rich and very kind of. It's theory heavy, but it doesn't have to be that hard either.
No, and it doesn't come up that often, but every time it does, it feels weird. So yes. Just having a bit of a grounding in the theory will help, I think.
And I will tell you, it is a very easy way to exit a tournament.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It doesn't come up that often, you're right, but they can be deadly situations where you're just like, oh no, you don't. I never, ever believe people in the blinds.
Yes.
I mean, they just never have it, but they always do. And so, but we'll talk about that.
All right. Well, lead us off, Fear Leader. I can't wait.
Yeah. Well, so I kind of wanted, there's three things that I touched on in the kind of the monthly premium seminar thing that then led into some examples and some deeper discussion. But first of all, I wanted to talk, because it's sort of in order of how this happens. So it all folds to us. We're in the small blind. And we have a decision to make. We can fold, we can complete, or we can raise. And I think one of the things to think about here is how do we approach that decision, and where do we go with this? And one of the things as I was reviewing this for the seminar that I think was really interesting to me is I looked at a lot of charts from like 10 big blinds to 100 big blinds and everywhere in between, and I would say that the amount that we fold from the small blind changes a little, but not that much. We're always folding the bottom 15, maybe 20% of our range. So we're playing 80% of our hands. What changed? Oh, go ahead.
Chris, this is just to be perfectly clear for our audience. This is only in circumstances where it's folded all the way around to the small blind.
Correct.
And the only person left in the hand is the small blind whose action it is, and the big blind to their left.
Right.
This is all to do with those spots.
So this is a lot like if you've studied any kind of heads up style play. There's some differences, obviously, because when you're the small blind there, you're going to have position, but there's a lot of similarities in that we're going to play a lot of our hands. So you're going to be in situations that are very unusual and uncomfortable to you. You're not used to being in a hand with Jack 3, has the person who opened and trying to figure out how to navigate that, right? So it puts you in these very challenging situations that are hard to figure out. But one of the things I think to point out is, regardless of stack size, we kind of fold that bottom 15 to 20%, and we're doing something with that top 80% of hands, which is a lot of hands. But what changes is how much we complete. And this is a really good rule. The deeper we are, the more often we limp or complete. So if we're 100 big blinds deep, we are completing a lot more than if we are 20 big blinds deep. Now at 20 big blinds deep, we're going to have some completes, some opens, and some shoves. And we're not going to have that at 100. So that is one thing in terms of opening from the small blind to just be aware of. And it's a good thing to look at, but just as a rule of thumb, that is kind of how to understand sort of what do I do with this even in the first place in the small blind.
And that might be counterintuitive to some of our listeners, because you think when you're deeper, you've got more behind, you can raise the pot, you can raise more often, get more folds from the big blind. And if they call, well, you've got a lot of chips behind. But the fact that you're going to be playing out of position exclusively is an argument not for bloating the pot. And against certain players, it also takes away their ability to kind of put you in jail with some bigger 3-bets. If you're and when Chris says completing, that's just limping. Limping and completing are the same thing. You're putting in the other half of the big blind. And when he talks about opening, that just means an open raise or shoving. Obviously, I think everyone knows what that is. You're not going to be shoving many small blinds at 100 big blinds deep, but at 20, you probably are.
And at 100, we're going to be completing and calling a lot. So when our opponent raises our completion, it doesn't mean that we're going to be playing fewer hands at 100 big blinds deep. It just means our approach to how we get to a flop is going to be different. So I don't know. Does that, and then any other thoughts on playing the small? I was going to then jump into some big blind stuff, but
just the sizing of the open, I think, is something that's interesting here, because this is one of those spots where, again, you're guaranteed to be out of position. And when you do choose to open raise instead of limping, typically we're going to see players opening to a larger sizing than they would from the button. And I know, again, I just said you don't want to play bigger pots out of position, but you're going to choose a strong range of hands, or at least a balanced, strong range of hands that can play bigger pots from out of position. And you are what you're doing with the larger sizing is you're just eliminating the big blind's ability to just make a real easy call, play a hand in position with a ton of their range. Yeah. So we want to give them a tougher decision than that and make them define their range a little more in those moments where we are open raising. Chris, is there like a certain size or something that you look for in particular, or how do you decide the size to open to there?
Mine is also very stack dependent. So when I'm 100 big blinds deep, and this actually is a little bit, I don't know. I see some players do this. I might be on the outside of the fringe of what, like the Wizards might do, but I will raise to 4.
Yep.
Big blinds when I'm really deep, and then come down. And then when we get down to to 20 big blinds, if I'm not shoving, now I'm doing like 2.5. So somewhere between 2.5 and 4 is where where I'm doing, but in general, it's usually around 3.5.
That's the same for me. And I always think about what would be my open size on the button. Okay, now add a big blind or add 3/4 of a big blind or add half a big blind or something like that. And that's the way I think about it too. Rob, is that how you look at it?
Yeah, that's exactly how I look at it. If you look at a lot of GTO charts, they talk about 2.5 at 100 big blinds is totally fine. The difference between 2.5 and 3 is minimal. So a lot of people go to 3, but I usually go to 2.5. And if I'm in the small blind, I go to 3.5.
Yeah.
And that'll be my open I'll just add a big blind if I'm opening from the small blind.
Yeah.
I'm always opening just one big blind larger than whatever my normal bet size is when I'm in position.
That's a good way to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Keith, what about you? Is that
Yeah, with the small blind complete, I think a factor that affects our range is going to be the ratio of the small blind to the big blind. Like in a 1-3 game, you're not getting as great of a price as in a 1-2 game. And in say like in a tournament where it's a 2,000, 3,000, 3,000, you're getting an awesome price. You gotta pretty much go in there with everything, if you're gonna small blind complete.
Great point.
Yeah, the new big blind ante has introduced these structure. It used to be that it was just always, double, right? You just, and they just find the chips to make that happen with antes and whatever. With the big blind ante, you're seeing these levels like 1,000, 1,500, and like 2,000, 3,000, and those kinds where we want to be aware of those because sometimes they're also the opposite. They're like 1,000, 3,000.
Right.
And so in the case where it's, not that much to complete, we're highly incentivized to play. And when it's a bigger, we're highly disincentivized to fold more, or we are incentivized to fold more.
That's a great point.
One other interesting thing about the small blind and different stack sizes, when you look at the GTO charts, there is not one hand in that chart that is 100% raise.
Mm-hmm.
Well, at least at the higher stack sizes. I think there is 100% raises when you get down to like 15, 20 big blinds.
Yep.
But when you're at that 40 to 60 to 100 big blinds, there's not one hand that's 100% raise.
Mm-hmm.
That's all a frequency thing of between raising and calling.
Yep.
Interesting.
Yep.
A lot of mixed strategy in that.
And that's one of the things I do talk about in the seminar video is a little bit of like how to approach that strategy. So you're not just going to drive, like, how am I ever going to remember that, queen jack offsuit, I'm supposed to do this 63% of the time. I'm supposed to raise it. And, like what am I going to do with that? And I think there are ways we can sort of, still try to mix up our game a little, but come up with some approaches that make it a little bit easier for a human being to do when they're actually playing.
And in the games that we're playing, our opponents are not going to be paying enough attention to know that we've decided that we're raising 7-5, but we're limping 7-4 100% of the time instead of doing them both at a mixed frequency. Right. So exactly. We can just make our lives easier and do it.
Yep.
And on top of that, the amount of times that it's small blind versus big blind is very, very small in comparison to the number of hands you play.
Yep.
Because somebody is usually getting involved that's in position.
The only thing that we want to, like, as we're thinking about this, is then what we don't want to say is, well, it's giving me permission to raise everything, because we want to be able to have in our completion range some like very strong pairs, some very strong hands, so that when we get raised, we have a course of action that includes some very strong holdings.
Yeah. And of course, and we're not making it easy for Chris. Chris is going to be talking about sort of in a vacuum. This is how we might take some of these ranges. If you've got a very aggressive player to your left who loves to raise over limpers and he's in the big blind, you might start limping more strong hands because you want to be able to re-raise or call in a position that kind of forces him to get bluffy post or something like that. But that's not really what we're talking about now. We're talking about having a grounded, balanced approach that is unexploitable itself, and then we can deviate from that to suit different opponents as we find out more about them.
All right, so let's talk about the big blind, right? Something happens. and we're in the big blind. And this is where I think even more than small, I think the mistakes I see sort of more recreational players make in these situations is, number one, they're folding the small blind too much when it gets to this spot. When it's blind versus blind, they're not playing 80 to 85% of their hands. They're just not. They're playing maybe 50. And so they're just folding too much. But the other mistake I see people making is from the big blind. I don't think people are taking, they're just barely raising anything but their very, very best hands. So, and we really want to come up with a strategy, especially against, because like, it's so easy to say, well, I've got 10-6, or I've got, 7-8, or let's just see a flop, but I think we're doing ourselves a disservice if we don't come up with a strategy for approaching these spots. And I don't see people raise enough from the big blind in these situations. And one of the things I think we want to do is have some of those best hands in our holdings. And this gets uncomfortable for a lot of players until you do it a few times. But you want to have some absolute trash in your raising range. You want to take your 2-5 offsuit along with your pocket kings and raise those. And you're going to feel really uncomfortable when you do it. But I'll tell you, it feels really good when somebody folds to your 2-5 offsuit after you've raised. It feels really, really good. It feels with this raise. Are you talking about a 3-bet or just raising over the small blind complete? Mostly above the complete. I mean, I think with 2-5 offsuit against a raise, I'm folding.
Yes. Good clarification. Yep.
But against a complete, we want to have more raise. I think it's so easy to take those kind of hands and just say, well, maybe I'll hit 5 deuce. Wouldn't that be exciting? But I think you can actually, if you think about a player's sort of limp or completing range from the small blind, there's going to be a lot of weak stuff in there, but it'll probably be stronger than your 5 deuce, and we can get a lot of that to fold.
And that's such a valuable. We talked about it last week. Getting players to fold a better hand than yours is a crucial part of your profit as a poker player. So using hands like very weak hands like 5-2 in the right spot is a great way to add to your ROI. And so just to be perfectly clear, so Chris is talking about spots where the small blind has chosen to limp, and now we're just adding some more combos to our raising range. And it sounds like we should be doing that not only with some more thinner value hands, but also with some absolute garbage, just to make them more likely to make a mistake, which is what we're all about here.
Yep.
I'm looking at a range that they published in Modern Poker Theory, which is a big blind versus a small blind limp at 60 big blinds. They're supposed to raise 43.8%.
Wow.
Of their range.
Wow.
And there's like 10 hands in total that they never raise.
Yep.
And that's pocket twos, some suited jacks, a couple of ace 4, ace 6 type hands. Everything else, there's a frequency of raising and calling of almost every other hand every hand has something. It's like 100% of your the card of range available is played from the big blind after the small blind limps.
And I would be stunned if most of our listening audience was even at half of that raising range. Because it's like, I think a lot of players, myself included, like let's see a flop. Let's see what happens. I don't have much of a hand here. But it's really doing yourself a disservice if you're kind of like falling. I think what you're falling back into is that first comfort level when you first started playing poker of like calling too much, of where you just kind of want to see a flop and hit something and then go with it, right? You want that sort of security blanket of knowing how your hand's going to play, and we can do more from the big blind by raising more, especially against the completes.
I've got a question. Sorry, go ahead, Rob.
Something that you don't think about too from the big blind, because you're so used to calling a small raise from someone in position when you're in the big blind. So you kind of lose track of the fact that, hey, you're going to be in position in this entire hand now. So you are effectively the button now.
Yep.
You're not the big blind anymore. You are the button, so you are in position. So you have a lot more leeway and a lot more equity realization.
That's a great point.
It's a great point.
Plus, we're not facing an open raise even. We're facing a limp from the small blind. So it's a range that should have a lot of weakness in it. And that's even more attractive to raise ourselves with that polarized range there. Keith, did you have something?
Yeah, I've got a cash game thought here. So a lot of players like to get into an agreement with the player to their left and to right to chop if it folds to the small blind. What do you guys think about that?
In a cash game, I love it because there's no rake involved. You're taking the rake right out of it, and that's why get involved in something when it's just the two of you, and you're going to end up paying rake to the house.
Yeah, when I'm talking about all this stuff, I'm really talking about tournaments. I think in cash games, if you can get away with that, if they'll allow chops, I would always advocate for it because of the rake.
John, what's your take on that?
I have a different view on it, and it's partly because I like to go to the casino when there are high hands, and not because I'm playing for a high hand, but I think high hands attract softer players.
And
so therefore, I just have a rule, and I even tell players ahead of time that I simply don't chop. I'm going to be consistent. And whether I have aces or whether I have 3-2 off or whatever, I play the hand. But most people like the fact that you're consistent about it.
Yeah, that's like from an etiquette point of view. That's a really interesting subject. And what John's getting at with the high hand here is some casinos will have promotions where if you can make like a straight flush, for instance, you might qualify for a high hand bonus. And so some players they might sort of collude against the casino to sort of say, well, why don't we just check this baby down and just choose not to put any more chips in the pot, but get to showdown with a hand that might qualify for the high hand bonus. So that's definitely a tactic. And I think as long as, and there's no right or wrong way to do this either. I think there is like this etiquette that you should kind of do the same thing every time. But I know some players that just look down, and if it's a good hand that they want to raise with, they raise. And if it's a hand that they want to hit the high hand with, they call. And if it's not, they'll just say, hey, you want to chop?
I don't, because I know what kind of hand you have now.
Yeah, that's the thing. And so, if you're going to be that player who lets the strength of their hand determine their action, then I think people are going to pick up on that pretty quickly. The other nice thing about...
If you ask for a chop, you're probably not putting any more chips in the middle anyway.
Right. That's true. Yeah, that's a good point. The other nice thing about chopping is that it does just speed the game along. So it's nice for you because you're not paying any rake, but it's also nice for everybody else in the hand because you just get to move on to the next hand a little faster, which is nice as well. But it's a really good point, and that's a good one to study there as well.
And if the last thing I kind of wanted to chat about in terms of blind versus blind for this episode, and one that sort of launches a really long piece that I had in the seminar thing was postflop, and really thinking about range advantage. I think that we're used to, as poker players, thinking about who has the advantage here, and we can look at a certain flop, we can look at a certain board texture, we can look at who had the opening and who called, or if it's 3-bet. And some of the same principles apply in blind versus blind situation, but you're going to be in situations where somebody has like completed and the big blind just checks behind, or and who has the range advantage then? And ultimately it's the small blind, right? Even though we've got the big blind that's in position, when we have a complete and a check behind, that should really favor the small blind, and they should be able to then approach that, because some, like we talked about, is that some of their completing range should still contain some of those really strong holdings. You should have sometimes aces and kings and some of those kinds of hands in your completing range, whereas the big blind really shouldn't. So that some of those kinds of things are going to play out. When the small blind opens or raises and the big blind calls, again, the small blind should have the advantage. And the only time that and this seems sort of obvious, but I think players don't think about this in this situation as much. The situation where the big blind has the advantage is when they have put in that aggressive action, where they've either raised the complete and had it been called by the small blind, or when the small blind has opened and the big blind has raised them and then been called by the small blind. Now the big blind not only has position, but they also have the range advantage, which is why I think a lot of these books like Modern Poker Theory are advocating for us to raise more from the big blind, because it gives us not only position, which you already had for the entire hand, now we have the advantage in the hand.
Yep. And I like the point that even if the small blind limps and the big blind just checks behind, the small blind, they've eliminated the bottom 20% of their range by continuing in the hand, and they still have the top 10%. Whereas the big blind, they haven't had a chance to fold yet, so they still have the bottom 20% of their range, and they had a chance to raise and didn't. So you can kind of eliminate the top part of their range as well. So, I mean, just intuitively, I can see how that really does. I mean, I want to just go play a bunch of hands from the small blind now and sort of realize my advantage by doing so.
And it's not like other limped pots, right?
Right.
So that's something to just really remember. I mean, some people will limp with aces from, the under the gun or whatever. So in some ways it is. We have to be cognizant of that. But we can have a very strong range when we limp from the small blind. And you're right, we're cutting off the bottom of a range. So we maintain that advantage, and it allows us to, especially on certain runouts and boards, it allows us to push that towards realizing our equity.
I guess we have to, unfortunately, it means we have to play poker post-flop a lot more often.
Yes.
Which is hard. Playing poker post-flop is hard.
Poker is hard.
It's a challenge for all of us. And I know for me, sometimes in the small blind, that really makes me want to just open raise so that I can just win their one big blind and get out of this position and move on, because I'm going to get the button next. And I love having the button. But I think already this is just, the upside is nice, but I think I can see how you're really costing yourself chips in the long run with that attitude.
And actually, go ahead.
One thing for the small blind player to remember: if he completes and then the big blind checks his option, that checked option is the most capped range in Texas Hold'em. You can really just pounce on it.
Yep. That's a great point.
Yep. And it's particularly on certain runouts, right? Like when you get like an ace king 4 flop or something, it's just like, I mean, this is mine. Just fold because this is mine. No matter what I'm holding, I'm not going to let you win this hand. But the other thing I hadn't even thought about talking about this tonight, but I think the one other thing when we're talking about blind versus blind that I think comes up a lot is when we get short stacked, and we see a lot of players from the small blind start shoving. And I think part of the question is, when do we do that? When do we shove from the small blind? When, let's say we've got, 15 to 20 big blinds and we see a lot of small blinds and we're 15 to 20 like effective and we see a lot of them shove. And then what do we do from the big blind? Do we call with a looser range than we would, in other sort of all-in situations? And the answer is both of these tend to be looser. The small blind will shove with a wider range, and the big blind can call with a wide. Like if like the hijack shoves and it folds to the big blind, they're going to have to call with a much tighter and better range than they will versus the small blind.
Yep, and that just makes sense intuitively. The small blind has to get through fewer players, so they can shove a wider range of hands. They can shove more hands. And because they're shoving wider, the big blind, playing in a vacuum, again, should be calling down lighter because their equity on those cusp hands improves against the weaker range and turns them into a call. So that makes a lot of sense. One question I've got, so we've talked about how a lot of this stuff is at a mixed strategy. Let's say we're in the big blind. What are some of the hands, or what are some of the qualities of hands that would make us choose not to raise with them? So we're raising with our absolutely worst hands, the 5-2 offsuit, and we're raising with our best hands, like the big pairs and ace king and that kind of stuff. Is those middle ground hands, what do they have in common where we're deciding to play them in position instead? Are they like mid pocket pairs? Are they suited connectors? What is it? What do they have in common that makes them less viable raising candidates? Nothing.
Well, because it's
just spread out over the whole range. Yeah.
Because it's everything. I mean, based on the charts that you look at, basically most of your suited aces are raises. All of your suited broadways, all of your pocket pairs down to 8s and 7s, they're pretty much all raises. But then there's a smattering of all the other hands. I mean, the whole chart has some frequency of raise for almost every single hand.
One thing I would say is common is suitedness. If we're not talking about like the best suited hands or the like suited connector type hands, the other ones that have sort of like that are suited. So like your 10-5 suited, your 7-4 suited, those kinds of hands, they may have some raises in them, but they're going to be more often ones that we're going to just decide to sort of let's just C3 and go from there. So that's because the trashy offsuit ones are the ones we're going to raise. The stronger suited ones we're going to raise more often, and the kind of like middling suited we're never folding ever.
Right.
And they're the kinds that we can just call or just check behind more often with.
So you might just to make it crystal clear. So you might check behind. So the small blind completes, they limp. You're in the big blind. You've got 10-3 offsuit. Or sorry, you've got 10-3 suited. So that might be one that's like good enough to see a flop with, that you don't have to bluff with it, but not so good that you're raising for value. Whereas a hand like 6-5 suited, you would raise
more often. Yes.
More often. Right. Good point. Even
here's
though it's
the thing.
got lower showdown value. Yeah.
Using 10-3 as an example, 10-3, you're going to 10-3 offsuit, you're going to raise 50% of the time and call 50% of the time. And 10-3 suited, you're going to call maybe 20% of the time raise 20% of the time and call 80% of the time.
Yeah.
Wow.
So you're calling a lot more with those suited hands than you are the offsuit hands.
Yep. That makes a lot of sense. And I guess for some of those hands in particular, that's interesting because you're going to have fewer ways to improve even if you do post flop. This is very interesting.
You really like to get with the 10-3 offsuit. That's why you're raising with it. You're really, really hoping for a fold.
Right.
And with the 10-3 suited, let's play and maybe I can win a really big one here.
You don't really know if you want to fold or not yet.
Right.
That's interesting. Okay, very cool. Well, so this is going to be available. This is the deep dive seminar for the month of August. And if folks are listening to this when it comes out, you've still got time to join us on the fourth Wednesday of the month at 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central. Chris will be hosting his monthly Q&A on the theme of the month. So that'll be a chance to come and pick his brain. We're going to be all the Learning with Partners videos this month are going to be related to blind versus blind somehow. The focus, a lot of our other learning material will be based around this subject, blind versus blind. So come join us on the fourth Wednesday of the month and share your hands and ask Chris questions, and we'll all learn a little more about this as we go. Right on. Well, thank you so much, Chris. I'm so impressed with every month we bring some amazing knowledge to our members. This is a really important month, I think, because like we said, it doesn't come up often, but when it does, you don't want it to be the first time you're thinking about it. So
I'll just tell you, like, I've studied this a lot lately because but in part because I did a report where I looked at just my blind versus blind play.
Yep.
Whew. It was not good.
Okay.
It was not good. So,
yep.
This can be an area where we can, at least I could get a lot better at.
Well, and if folks are using Poker Tracker 4, you can customize your tags that you use for individual hands that you're reviewing later. I've got one built for blind versus blind play, and the icon is a beer mug because it can get a little crazy. So yeah, I'm with you there. All right. Well, thank you very much to Chris Jones, Keith Brandt, Rob Washam, and John Crowell for joining us here in the chat tonight. And of course, website AMP and Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino. And you, the listener, thank you so much for making it possible.